I'll do my best to keep it as quiet as possible, but they are right above me drilling. So maybe if I have to move, I have to move. All right. So as I said, thanks for joining me. You've probably already seen the topics that are coming up today, and they're probably going to be a little bit different than the topics we've talked about the previous few weeks. If you saw any of the stuff that I did with Erin Carroll this past weekend, we talked a little bit more about kind of how we look at nutrition versus the deep dive, nitty gritty kind of scientific aspect of things, and more just kind of looking at how we view food, how we think of it in our day-to-day life, our mindsets around it, maybe some of our beliefs, whether limiting or not, around it, and all those other things that kind of go into that, let's say, the emotional attachment to food, that bucket. Because really, how we think about food ultimately dictates what we do with it and our decisions around it. So it doesn't matter how much knowledge we have about something. If we have a mindset, if we have an emotion, we have a limiting belief or just a belief system built around stuff, it's very hard to just kind of white knuckle it and make things happen if they don't match our belief system around a particular thing. So if I hopefully getting the idea of what I'm talking about here, so we'll move straight on. So usually my workshop objectives for this are to try and give you some actionable takeaways around either nutritional habits or actually the science, like the actionable things that you can do, like things to eat, that kind of stuff. But the idea for today, the objective is slightly different. All of today's topics, as I said, will be around mindset, the mindset that we take to food and how basically we use the scripts that we write for ourselves, and how we can maybe change them to serve us a little bit better. So still hopefully be some actionables, but they'll be a little bit different. We won't categorize them in terms of nutrition or in terms of habits. All right. It will more be around kind of reshaping how we think about food. So the topics for this week, and I put them out yesterday, so going to be some common nutritional mindsets that are detrimental to our health. There's likely that we all hold some. Some of us are going to hold the same ones. Some of us are going to have very unique ones. Narratives that we use and the beliefs that we hold about food. So those are pretty similar topics, and we'll kind of go through this in a sequential fashion. And then how to rewrite those scripts to something more useful. So maybe just having a look at how we think about food, how we use it, how we respond to it, how we look at it in our day-to-day, and maybe where, kind of going back to things like, where did those narratives, where did those scripts come from? And how can maybe we rewrite them to serve us in a slightly different or a better way in this time of our life. All right. So what do we mean by limiting food beliefs, nutritional mindset, and nutritional narratives? So these are some of the things that, if you can see it on the screen, great. If you can't see it on the screen, as I said, you'll see it later on. But some common limiting food beliefs are things like eggs are a breakfast food, right? Some people just will only eat eggs at breakfast. Some people won't, but some people will only eat eggs at breakfast. Meals have to have a side dish, a drink, and a dessert. Like that's the structure which they have, they believe about food. Things around there, like their beliefs around food and how it affects them, can be things like, my metabolism is slow. So unless we've gone and had like a hormone panel done, we don't really know if that's the case or not. No, again, another one is like, I'm addicted to food. It's the way that we kind of protect ourselves from food, either whether we've been diagnosed with some form of addictive property towards food, addictive action towards food. Things like, I gain weight easily. I gain weight easily, again, unless we've been to the doctor and we've had some hormone panels done, and we've had some blood panels done, and we've really done a deep dive into those things. There's likely those beliefs that are maybe holding us back, and are maybe, let's say, skewing the vision or skewing the idea that we have of food. So when we say nutritional mindset, what do we mean by nutritional mindset? So it's the way we use food, not just what we believe about it, but then how we use it. So for example, some people might believe that following a diet is the only way to gain control over their eating, to gain control over how they do, how they do in terms of their physical performance, how they look, how they feel, that a diet is the only way to do that. And then things like nutritional narratives is, again, so these are all kind of interchangeable phrases, but we'll try and define them a little bit more as we go on. But I don't know about you, but I was brought up that with a particular nutritional narrative of, I could only leave the table once I'd eaten all my food, clean the plate idea. that I needed to eat all my vegetables to earn my dessert, to earn my ice cream. I'm sure I'm not the only one there. So we'll kind of unpack those a little bit more as we go through the rest of the session. So let's take a second to define what we mean by nutritional mindset. So ultimately, it's how we view our relationship with food, how we think about it. And there's a good chance that we don't see it maybe as a major issue. After all, it's how we think about food and the purpose that it serves. And we need it to live. So some people will think about food in a very particular way, but we're not always thinking about food. It's not the only thing we think about. It's one of the things we think about, but maybe we only think about it in a superficial level. So what I mean by that is that, like, where's my next meal coming from? I'm hungry. What can I eat? But in the background, we have these nutritional mindsets that are already kind of pre-programmed into us, and they were likely pre-programmed into us as a product through our experiences and our environments in the past. So let's think about growing up, think about our parents, thinking about, the ages of food in which we grew up in, the abundance in which food was around the house or lack thereof. All those things are contributing factors to how we currently think and feel about food. So when we discern what's essential, health is almost always at the top. And food is a big portion of health. Without health, everything else is kind of a moot point. So although it's kind of a contradiction to what I'm saying, right? I recognize that we are always thinking about food, but it's maybe subconscious. Food is always part of what we do on a day-to-day basis, which is why it's really important that we challenge some of the mindsets, challenge some of the thought processes that we have about food, and that maybe we structured a long time ago and maybe don't serve us as well anymore. So the way I categorize this, and I'm sure there's people who fall outside of it, but you might recognize yourself in one of these two camps. So often people fall into one of two distinct camps. And they're either self-proclaimed mindset camps, let's say, and they're most likely self-proclaimed. Most people either fall into functional eaters. What they would say is like they're a health nut. Everything they do is based around their health. They train, they eat, they sleep, they do all those things, and food is a big portion of that. And then they eat for enjoyment. So functional eaters and enjoyment eaters. So people self-proclaim they're foodies. Whereas something is that's more of an emotional attachment to food. But actually, both of those ways we think about food we let those things ultimately become defining characteristics for us. And oftentimes, the way we think about food doesn't need to live in one extreme camp or another. It can live on a sliding scale. And oftentimes we can think, we can enjoy our food and we can be functional eaters. We can wake up in the morning with an early training session and say, probably need some carbohydrates. I'll have a banana and a protein shake. And then later on in the evening, or if I'm going out at the weekend, I can say, I want to go out and I want to enjoy my food. I'm going to go out with friends. So maybe we choose this restaurant to go to. But you likely recognize yourself more so in one of those camps, more so than another, more frequently than another. So functional eaters and enjoyment eaters, or health nuts and foodies. I think that's probably a definition that a lot of people have given me, the people that I've worked with in the past. So what ultimately unites both of these camps is that both labels are often skewed and can and probably should be challenged as we evolve. Right? So we don't always have to be foodies. We don't always have to be health nuts. They are not defining characteristics. They're not defining, they're not defining characteristics as to who we are. And we can slide in and out of both of those as and when we want to, okay? So I recognize that a lot of what I'm saying to you are basically blanket statements, but you can take them on face value and do with them as you please. So it's important that we challenge our nutritional mindsets. So this idea is likely a good lesson in life in general, and one that probably all of us should do in other areas of our life as we go through it. And we probably already do look at other areas of our life and kind of challenge how we think about things. So we look at data objectively and we make adjustments in everything that we do, from the route we take to work on a commute to, how we save for retirement. We look at data and then we make adjustments based off it. For whatever reason, oftentimes food kind of falls outside of that, and we can find ourselves being not obsessive, but extreme at either end of how we look at food. Either we're all in enjoyment eaters or we're all in functional eaters. And the fact is that it's oftentimes not that defined, and we can slide in and out, up and down between those two things. The reason that is partly the case is because, our relationships with food are probably formed or likely formed from our early experiences as we are as kids. So what I mean by that is, I grew up in a household in the 90s where if my mum wanted to lose weight or improve her fitness, she would eat rice crackers and she'd have a Diet Coke at 11 o'clock to, stem her hunger, or to stem her cravings. Like, that's the stuff that was told to her, and therefore that was the stuff that was likely passed on to me. My dad, on the other hand, if he was, going to get up early and go to the gym and pump iron, he was drinking raw egg yolks as a, because that was the genre, that was the time in which we grew up in. And it was a hard time for me as growing up. I used to throw away the yolks out of eggs because I used to believe that, well, I'd seen my dad drink raw eggs, probably not going to go that far, but usually take the yolks out of it because fat makes you fat. That was just a narrative that I had to outlearn, right? So that's something simple that most of us probably now know that is not the case, but it was something that I had to challenge and therefore just learn extra data about. And in any other walk of life, just as I said, like our commute to work or how we save for retirement or any of those things, we all ultimately end up looking at them with objective eyes. When food gets put on the table, quite literally, when food gets put on the table, we have a tendency to not look at it objectively, and we have a tendency to respond to it emotionally, which is absolutely fine, but we don't need to always respond to it emotionally. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the environment around us has changed. So, what we knew about rice crackers and Diet Coke at 11 o'clock in the 90s is no longer what we know. It's no longer the narrative that we're being kind of fed in the modern world. If anything, it's probably worse now. So it's always important to continuously challenge the narratives that we have. Like, maybe we believe that, eggs are only a breakfast food. Well, why is that the case? I could probably get more out of that. Why are eggs only a breakfast food? Is there any particular magic behind that? We don't always have to have a bag of chips or a bag of crisps and a Diet Coke with our sandwich, because sandwiches can live alone, right? They don't have to just be as a complete meal, that kind of stuff. So always just challenging how we think about food on a day-to-day basis, and not becoming polarized or extreme in our view of how food serves us, whether we're emotional eaters, whether we're functional eaters. All right. So moving on to the next little bit. So I guess I'm just going to go through a couple of points here, and you can, in your head, you can probably say, yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's me. Yeah, that wasn't me, but yeah, that was probably me. When I think about the things that contributed to my mindset and the things that I still try and overcome right now. So when I was growing up, I was told multiple things, like, you need to clean your plate at every meal. There are kids starving in whatever country, so you need to eat everything on your plate. You have to eat all your vegetables before you can get your dessert. And then things like, are you full? Are you full? Do you want another piece? You should eat until you're full. These are all narratives that, I still think of, that constantly still live in me. I still have a really hard time going to a restaurant and not clearing my plate, not eating everything on it, because that's how I was pre-programmed to do it. So I think mindfulness is probably a buzzword that's maybe overused, but it's very important that we show some mindfulness when it comes to food, because if we don't have mindfulness, we're basically becoming passive. And if we are doing something like eating out at a restaurant and somebody puts a massive plate of food in front of you, and the narrative that we currently have in our head goes unchecked of, I have to eat everything on that plate in order to be good, that's what I have to do, then ultimately we're going to end up over consuming, maybe making ourselves feel a little bit sick, gaining weight, feeling ill, whatever it is. But there's probably going to be some degrading responses to doing that, right? So just constantly thinking about those narratives that maybe live inside your head around food, and endlessly challenging them. So obviously this isn't a slight or a dig at our parents. It's a request that, we challenge what we feel and what we think we know about food, what we think we know about meals, our feelings around food, our emotions that that each of them bring, and that how we respond to those emotions and feelings is important. That we draw some mindfulness, we draw some attention to, how am I responding to this food cue, right? How am I responding to this thing that's been put in front of me? In other areas of our life, we pride ourselves on self-improvement and learning new data. And ultimately, food is no different. It's just how it's kind of programmed into the fabric of who we are as human beings in the modern world. But it ultimately has the opportunity to be looked at in as just as an objective way as anything else can. And that's not an easy task to do, but it can be done. And it should definitely try and be done. We should try and show some mindfulness towards it. Okay. So good news. I've written on the slides here. Good news. Times have changed since we were kids. And we can be more specific about the nutrition data that we consume. So I mentioned this a little bit on Saturday with Erin in my previous workshop, which was, you know, a diet is just something that we consume. It's a variety of things that we consume. So we mean that I mean that in the most literal sense in terms of food, but it's not just the food that we consume. It's also the information that we consume. So be conscious on a day-to-day basis of all the things that you're seeing about food culture, about diet culture, about how, you know, we respond to food. And if it's things like your Instagram and social media, Facebook, that kind of stuff, you know, pick and choose the things that you take literally, pick and choose the things that you take personally. And if you find yourself being inundated with things that maybe don't serve you very well, feel free to cull that from your data diet. Cull that, you know, go and look for better pieces of information, more useful pieces of information around health and nutrition that that maybe serve you a little bit better. And who knows, 5 years from now, maybe that information won't be as relevant for you and you'll go and find it differently and you'll go and find it somewhere else. But try and find a data that serves you better. If it's data that makes you feel anxious, tired, ill, you know, and like you're not good enough, the likelihood is that those pieces of information are probably not the best use of your time, specifically for food. Okay. Excuse me. So we'll move on a little bit from there. So here's some of the big bang for your buck changes that I end up having with, I end up talking about with a lot of my kind of one-on-one clients, whether it's personal training or whether it's through nutrition as well. So the big bang for the buck changes is something that I end up calling my food for thought. It's a little play on numbers there. Food, the number 4, and thought, because it's 4 changes. It's 4 kind of things that seem to be big bang for the buck kind of questions to ask people. And it's likely that you can unpack this a little further in your own study as you do a little bit more. So these are 4 narratives that I'll challenge people to use as replacements for their current narrative. So number 1, not every meal is a celebration. So food for us is a lot of the time in the modern world, food is built around family. It's built around comfort. It's built around particular times of year. You know, think about Christmas. Think about, you know, any of the big holidays. Think about, you know, Thanksgiving. All of those, specifically in the US, are all kind of bred around, no pun intended there, but they're all kind of bred around this communal meal idea, right? And we think about some of our most memorable and happiest times of oftentimes they've been wrapped around food, because food is always with us, and it's very easy to make the attachment of go to a particular place, go to a nice restaurant, you remember that place and that thing and that time, and the restaurant is part of it, the food experience is part of it. And that can be the same said for the entirety of you know, your life in general. The opposite is also true. If you go to a place where you remember going and you had a bad time and the restaurant that you went to wasn't that good, you probably also remember that bad time, but that signal, that emotion isn't as strong as the good times, right? Because we're pre-programmed as human beings to remember the positive more than the negative. So remember, not every meal is a celebration. Try and have what I would call an abundance mindset. So remember that we live in a world of Grubhub and Foodler and delivery and Uber Eats and all that stuff. You can always get it another day. It's as easy as a click of a button to be able to get something delivered to your house whenever you want it. So if there's a time when, you know, your food is available to you, but it doesn't necessarily match your goals, thinking of it as like, is this a celebration? Is this a time when I need to be, you know, where I get to be or need to be all consumed within this moment of eating lots of pizza or, you know, any of those things that we typically attach to being emotional food or, you know, unhealthy food, let's say. You know, you can always have the opportunity, providing you draw your mindfulness towards it, you always have the opportunity to say, you know, do I really want this today? Do I need this today? You know, does this match my goals today? If the choice is yes, go ahead and enjoy it. Really, you know, have at it, you know, because that is life. And that's, you know, we don't want to start trying to cutting out any particular food. If, however, you feel like you're more focused on your goal that day, remember that it's just as easy, if you feel tomorrow that you really did want pizza and you missed out on pizza last night, you can get pizza whenever you want, right? It won't be the last time that you get the opportunity to have pizza or cake or whatever it is, right? So having an abundance mindset around food is super useful and, a very important skill to try and hone. The next thought process, and number two in the food for thought list, is that hunger in the modern world is rarely an emergency. So for the vast majority of us, kind of, unless we're hangry, hunger aside, it's important to remember that it's okay to feel hungry and that we can take our time to respond to it. So we don't have to respond to hunger immediately. We can pay attention to, well, maybe why do I feel hungry? How long ago was it since my last meal? Did I just work out for 3 hours and not get anything after it? Am I bored? Am I dehydrated? But take time to respond to your hunger cues. And if it just so happens that, you feel like you're in a really good place and your only option is to, get a slice of pizza, but that doesn't necessarily match your goals, but you might only have to wait another hour before you can get home and eat the thing that maybe you'd planned to do or that you have a little bit more control over. That is absolutely fine to feel hungry. Hunger is not always an emergency, and it's not always something that needs to be quelled immediately. All right. So number 3 in the list of food for thought is that health is ultimately not an on-off switch. Health is a great big word with lots of things that goes into it, but let's say health or nutrition is not an on-off switch. Think of it more like a dimmer versus just a flick on-off, something that you can dial up, something that you can dial down. Because as life fluctuates, we need to make sure that we're adaptable with it. Okay, so maybe there is a time where you know that you're not going to be able to get home to eat that pre-planned meal that you'd had in your mind, and now you need to be able to go out and make as good a decision as you can, or somebody spontaneously says after work, hey, do you want to go out and grab a beer, and you go to a bar and you end up, and burgers are your option. If you end up having a burger, fantastic, go ahead and enjoy it, have a beer, have a burger. It does not undo all the other things. It doesn't, that burger or that less than effective choice or less efficient choice does not define us, just like the great choices don't define us. If you've ever been to a bar, or if you've ever been to a place where you've sat down and somebody has just rabbited off all the ways that they are, really dialed in on their nutrition, on their fitness, nobody likes being around that person. Just in the same way that nobody needs or enjoys being around the person who's the opposite side of the coin, who says like, oh, I'm a terrible person and I've fallen off the wagon. Those things they're so extremes, they're so polarized in terms of our, how we view our choices. Very few people have quote unquote fallen off the wagon. You're just a slider. It's just about turning up the dial when we feel like we have more capacity, or we can create more capacity to turn up the dial and be more focused on our health. And sometimes things get in the way and we've got responsibilities and we end up being in quarantine, and maybe the dial has to get turned down. And that is the way that ultimately we have the opportunity to respond to our environment. It's not just an on-off switch, right? We don't have to be all in one direction or another. And then the final thing, and the reason I leave this for the last one, typically for most people, is because it's really an all-encompassing thought process around all the other things that we've talked about, which is you're always one good decision away from being right back on track. So even if you do feel like you've fallen off the wagon, even if you feel like, things are kind of in disarray, we always have to start somewhere, right? You've probably heard many, every mile starts with one step. Because it's true, you have to put one foot in front of the other, and you have to just begin to start kind of linking good or efficient choices together in a row. And you're always one good decision away from being right back on track. It doesn't have to become this deleterious process where, like, if you end up having a burger after doing really well and feeling like you're in a good place for 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time, and then you have a burger, it doesn't have to be like, I've got a puncture, so I slash all my tires and go gung-ho and make even more inefficient decisions in a row. It just is what it is. It exists. We can't change anything about it. We have the opportunity to enjoy it. And if anything, we want to try and build in those moments and kind of take comfort in them. We want to have them be part of our life so that they don't seem so extreme when they happen, because they naturally will happen. Nobody can live in a bubble. Nobody can control everything all the time. You can only control the things that you can control. And sometimes, just like that dimmer switch, you'll be able to control a few more things and you'll be able to ramp up the intensity. And sometimes you'll be able to control a few less things. You'll have to dial down the intensity. And that's just a reasonable way to look at things. The really hard way to do, the reason this is so difficult to do is oftentimes it feels like we're trying to apply logic to an emotional situation, because it is emotional and food is part of our everyday and it is attached to our emotions, and it's coupled with lots of other feelings. So it's just paying attention to those emotions, because we can't immediately just delete them or ignore them or bury them, because that doesn't work and eventually you end up with a tumor. So it's not going to happen, right? All we can do is pay attention to them and then start trying to gradually layer some more reasonable or logical steps on top of them. But we have to pay attention to them. They don't define us. They don't, it's not an all-in or an all-out mindset. We're always one good decision away from being right back on track. And then the goal is to just link together as many good decisions as we can, and then try not to break the chain. That's it. It's just try not to break the chain. It's not don't break the chain. And it's not that if you break the chain or if something goes a little bit awry, you're a bad person. The adaptability of our mindset around food and how we think about food and how flexible we can be with our thought process around it is really, really important. This is week 8 of this workshop, and I found myself putting off having this conversation because I feel like it's probably the hardest conversation for most people to have, both with a coach or with themselves. So I kind of feel a little bit lucky that I'm just talking into a void today, because I would probably get a little bit put off maybe by people's responses to it, because everybody has their own version of, how food makes them feel, and everybody has their own version of what food means to them, certain types of food at certain times of day. So the big takeaways from this are really those final four points, all encompassed by, we don't have to think about food in absolutes. We don't have to think about food in the way that we think of it right now isn't the way that we have to think about it forever. Challenge how we currently think and feel about food. Pay attention, draw some mindfulness to our overall narrative by which we use food in our life on a day-to-day basis, or we consume food, not necessarily use it. I end up using it because I probably fall more into the functional eater than the emotional eater that we mentioned earlier on. Sorry, the enjoyment eater that we mentioned earlier on. So that's how I see it, but I have to constantly challenge that narrative of, am I really a functional eater? And if I really spend lots of time being a functional eater, the time I become an enjoyment eater, how does it make me feel? Am I adaptable, or do I kind of fall off the rails and think, oh my God, you're a bad person for doing X, Y, and Z? We need to make sure that we constantly challenge our narrative around how we think and feel about food. And that's a really hard conversation, but it's something that we always need to do. So I'll keep trying to bring this conversation up a little bit more. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you got some value out of it. Even if it's just the slightest thing, if it made you feel uncomfortable enough to think about it a little bit further, that's fantastic. So the big takeaways from today: not every meal is a celebration. Hunger is rarely an emergency. Health is not an on-off switch, and you're always one good decision away from being right back on track. They're the 4 main points that I use with people on a day-to-day basis to try and help them challenge their food narratives, and hopefully you can do the same. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Let me know if you have any questions.